When they handed Raymond Calloway the smallest envelope at his father's funeral, everyone in that oak-paneled room tried not to smile. His brother got the house. His sister got the investment accounts. Raymond got a single rusty key on a worn leather cord, and a handwritten note that said only, "You always were the one who knew how to look." Nobody laughed out loud, because that would have been indecent. But Raymond saw the looks they traded, the quick, satisfied glances, the barely suppressed relief, and he understood exactly what they meant. He was 53 years old, standing in his father's study, in a suit that was 2 years out of fashion, and every person in that room believed he had just been written out of the most important story of his life. They were wrong. They were so spectacularly, irreversibly wrong that the truth of it would shake every single one of them to their foundations before the year was out. But on that cold February afternoon, Raymond Calloway just folded the note, slipped the key into his breast pocket, and pressed it against his chest like it was the only warm thing left in the world. Because in a way, it was. Let me take you back to the beginning. Because this story, like all the best ones, didn't start where it appears to start. It started long before Raymond's father died. It started, really, in a moment 40 years earlier that Raymond barely remembered and everyone else had chosen to forget. Raymond Calloway grew up as the middle child in a family that wore its wealth the way some men wear a watch, not for time, but for status. His father, George Calloway, had built a modest regional manufacturing business into something genuinely impressive over 3 decades of hard, relentless work. George was a self-made man in the truest sense, and he never let anyone forget it, least of all his 3 children. Raymond's older brother, Douglas, was everything George wanted in an heir. Broad-shouldered, loud, quick with numbers, quicker with charm. He'd gone to business school at George's insistence, married a woman from an old money family, and slid into the company like he'd been shaped specifically to fill the role. Raymond's younger sister, Pamela, had the same effortless confidence as Douglas, the kind of ease that comes from knowing you're loved unconditionally by the person whose approval matters most. Raymond was different. He was quieter, deeper, the kind of boy who read books nobody assigned and asked questions nobody wanted to answer. He wasn't weak. That's important to understand. But he lacked the aggressive certainty that George Calloway seemed to prize above almost everything else. George loved Raymond, but he didn't quite understand him. And in George Calloway's world, what he didn't understand, he tended to undervalue. When Raymond was 13, there was an incident that the family never discussed afterward, but that shaped the next 4 decades of his life, in ways none of them fully grasped. Raymond had discovered, hidden behind a false panel in the back of the old gardener's shed on their property, a collection of documents, ledgers, and correspondence that made no sense to a 13-year-old, but felt, instinctively, important. He brought the papers to his father with the earnest excitement of a kid who thinks he's done something wonderful. George had gone very still when he saw them. Then he'd smiled, that tight, controlled smile Raymond had learned to read as the opposite of warmth, and said, "Good boy, now forget you ever found those." He'd taken the papers, and Raymond had done what he was told. He'd forgotten. Or rather, he'd buried the memory under all the ordinary weight of growing up. By the time Raymond was in his 20s, the family dynamic had calcified into its permanent form. Douglas ran the business alongside George. Pamela managed the family's charitable foundation, a role she excelled at and that kept her firmly in George's good graces. Raymond had gone a different direction. He'd gotten a degree in history, then a master's in archival studies, and had spent his career working for a series of museums and historical preservation societies, cataloging old documents, restoring forgotten records, coaxing the past back into legibility. He was good at it. He was genuinely gifted at finding meaning in things that other people had dismissed as worthless or obsolete. He was not, by any visible measure, successful. Not in the way his family measured success. He made a decent salary. He lived in a small but comfortable apartment in Providence, Rhode Island. He had never married, though he'd been close once, with a woman named Elise, who'd ultimately decided that his quietness was a kind of absence she couldn't live inside of. He had good friends, deep interests, a life that felt full to him even when it looked spare to others. But at family gatherings, Thanksgiving, Christmas, his father's legendary 4th of July parties, Raymond was always the footnote, the one people checked in on out of obligation, and then moved away from when something more interesting appeared. George had never been cruel to Raymond, not exactly, but he had been consistently, casually dismissive in that particular way that hurts more than cruelty, because it's so much harder to name. He'd stop mid-sentence when Raymond offered an opinion at the dinner table. He'd ask Douglas about business decisions, and forget to ask Raymond anything at all. He'd introduced Raymond to friends as, "my son who works with old papers," in a tone that made it sound like a hobby rather than a vocation. And Raymond had absorbed all of it, the way a dry landscape absorbs rain, quietly, thoroughly, without making a scene. So when George Calloway died of a sudden heart attack on a Tuesday morning in January, at the age of 81, and the family gathered 3 days later for the reading of the will, Raymond already knew, in the bone-deep way you know certain things, that he was not going to come out of it well. He was right. The Calloway family home, a sprawling Victorian in Newport with 11 rooms and a view of the bay that real estate agents salivated over, went to Douglas. The investment portfolio, $3.7 million, neatly diversified, went to Pamela. Various personal items were distributed among grandchildren and the few old friends George had bothered to name, and to Raymond, the key, the rusty, insignificant, apparently worthless key on its worn leather cord, and the note, "You always were the one who knew how to look." Douglas had clapped him on the shoulder on the way out and said, with the practiced warmth of a man who doesn't feel what he's performing, "Dad loved you, Ray. He just, you know how he was." Pamela had hugged him and asked if he needed money, the way you ask someone if they need a glass of water, when what they really needed was the whole ocean. Raymond drove back to Providence that night in the February dark, the key on the seat beside him like a companion. He didn't feel the grief of the disinheritance as acutely as he might have expected. What he felt was something more complicated, a kind of curiosity that had been dormant for years, quietly reawakening. Because he knew his father. He knew the economy of the man, the precision with which George Calloway did everything. George did not do anything without intention. He did not give a gift, even a seemingly small one, without reason. The note wasn't sentiment. It was instruction. You always were the one who knew how to look. Raymond sat at his kitchen table that night with the key in his hands and thought about what he knew and what he didn't. The key was old. He could tell that much from decades of working with historical objects. The metal had the particular patina of something at least 50 years old, possibly more. The design was simple, utilitarian, the kind of key made for a lock rather than for beauty. There was a small mark near the bow, the top, circular part, that he had to hold under his magnifying glass to read. 2 letters, stamped into the metal, CV, CV. He turned those letters over in his mind all night. He made coffee and drank it, and made more. He pulled out the small collection of family documents he kept. Old photos, letters his father had sent him over the years, a few things he'd accumulated from family gatherings. He wasn't looking for anything specific yet. He was doing what he always did at the beginning of an archival investigation, building context, letting the material speak. It was almost 2 in the morning when something caught his eye. It was an old photograph, one he'd seen 100 times without ever really examining, of George Calloway as a young man, perhaps 25, standing outside a building Raymond didn't recognize. George was smiling the real smile in this one, not the controlled version, but the wide-open smile of a man who is genuinely happy. He was holding something in his right hand. Raymond held the photo under his lamp and reached for his magnifying glass. The object in George Calloway's hand was a key on a leather cord. Raymond's breath caught. He sat with that for a long moment, feeling the gears of something enormous beginning to turn. The next morning, he called his father's oldest surviving friend, a man named Walter Ames, who had known George Calloway since they were in their 20s together, and who had attended the funeral with the careful dignity of a man who has outlived almost everyone he loves. Walter was 83 and still sharp, living in a retirement community in Sarasota, and he picked up on the third ring. "Raymond," he said warmly, "I was wondering when you'd call." That phrasing was interesting. I was wondering when, not I was wondering if. "Walter," Raymond said, "I need to ask you something about my father, about when he was young." There was a pause on the line. "I figured you might," Walter said. "Your father told me once, maybe 15 years ago, that if anything ever happened to him, you'd be the one to ask. Said you were the only one of his kids who'd know what questions to ask." Raymond felt something shift in his chest. What did he mean by that? Another pause. Longer this time. "Raymond, how much do you know about the Calloway family before your grandfather?" Raymond thought about it. "Almost nothing. My grandfather died before I was born. Dad never talked about him much." "No," Walter said quietly. He wouldn't have. Your grandfather had a complicated history. George spent his whole adult life trying to get clear of it. But complicated histories have a way of leaving things behind. Things that don't disappear just because you want them to. A pause. He left you the key, didn't he? Yes. Then go back to the house, Walter said. Go back to Newport. Go to that old property on Bellevue. Not the house your father lived in, the original one. The one your grandfather built. It burned down in 1962, but the foundation is still there. There's a storage building on the edge of the property that survived. Your father never sold that parcel. He kept the taxes paid on it for 60 years, every single year, without telling anyone why. Raymond wrote the address down with a hand that wasn't entirely steady. Walter, he said, what am I going to find? Walter Ames was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was very old and very careful. The truth, he said, about where your family really comes from, and I think you're ready for it, even if the others aren't. He hung up before Raymond could ask another question. Raymond drove to Newport the following morning. He found the address Walter had given him on the far edge of Bellevue Avenue, behind a rusted iron gate overgrown with decades of ivy. The main property was visible only as a ghost, a rectangular depression in the earth, where a foundation had once stood, now filled with weeds and young trees that had grown up through the old stonework. But at the back of the property, just as Walter had said, there was a small stone building about the size of a large garden shed, its walls thick and its door sealed with a lock. Raymond stood in front of that door in the cold February air and took the key from his pocket. His hand was steady now. The curiosity had taken over, the way it always did when he was deep in an investigation, and it was stronger and cleaner than the grief. He put the key in the lock. It fit perfectly. The tumblers turned with a sound that had clearly not been made in many years, a deep, unhurried click that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than the mechanism itself. Raymond pushed the door open. Inside, it smelled of age and stone and something faintly metallic. There was no electricity. He'd brought a flashlight, and he swept its beam across the interior. Shelves lined the walls. On them, covered in dust but otherwise intact, were boxes. Dozens of them. Wooden boxes with brass fittings, the kind used for document storage a century ago, each one labeled in a precise, unfamiliar hand. Raymond crossed the threshold, and the cold outside seemed to stop at the door. He reached for the nearest box and lifted the lid. Inside were documents, legal documents, handwritten correspondence, old ledgers. All of it in excellent condition. This building had no moisture, he realized. It had been built specifically to preserve what was inside. His trained eye swept across the top pages, and the words that jumped out at him made him sit down heavily on the stone floor. Callaway and Voss, 1921. Certificate of Partnership. Callaway and Voss. CV. He began to read. What Raymond pieced together over the next 3 hours, sitting on the cold stone floor of that sealed building with his flashlight slowly dimming, was the outline of a story that George Callaway had apparently spent his entire life trying to bury. Raymond's grandfather, Edward Callaway, had not built his original fortune alone. He had built it in partnership with a man named Heinrich Voss, a German immigrant who had come to Newport in 1918 with almost nothing and an extraordinary talent for mathematics and finance. The two men had met working on the docks, had recognized in each other a shared hunger, and in 1921 had formalized a partnership that over the next decade had grown into something significant, a trading and investment company that had done very well indeed in the years before the Depression. Then, in 1931, Heinrich Voss had disappeared from the historical record. Gone. No death certificate, no bankruptcy filing, no announcement of dissolution. The partnership had simply ceased, and Edward Callaway had continued alone, claiming the whole enterprise as his own. Raymond looked for evidence of what had happened. He found it in a sealed envelope near the bottom of the third box, addressed in Edward Callaway's hand to no one, for now, the private correspondence of a man who couldn't resist the written record even of his own crimes. The letter was a confession, of sorts. Edward had discovered in 1931 that Heinrich Voss was planning to dissolve the partnership and take his share, a full 50%, to fund his return to Germany to support his family, who were facing desperate circumstances as the Weimar Republic collapsed. Edward had forged documents showing that Voss had accepted a buyout for a fraction of his actual stake. He had used those forged documents to push Voss entirely out of the partnership, leaving the man with almost nothing after a decade of equal labor and investment. Voss had tried to fight it legally, but the lawyers Edward hired were better than anything Voss could afford, and the case had been dismissed. Voss had left the country in 1932, virtually destitute. Raymond sat with this for a long time. He felt the specific nausea of a person who has just learned something irreversible about someone they thought they knew, even someone they had complicated feelings about. His grandfather had stolen the foundation of the family fortune. And his father had known. George Calloway had known. And he had kept this building locked, kept the property, kept the evidence, not destroying it, never quite able to destroy it, but hiding it so completely that nobody had ever found it. Except that wasn't quite the end of the story, was it? Because if it had been, George would simply have burned these documents. He'd had 60 years to do it. He had chosen not to, which meant that George had left it deliberately, with the key given to Raymond, who knew how to look, because George had wanted something to be done with it. Raymond went back to the boxes. He went through every one of them, methodically, the way he'd been trained. The afternoon faded. He turned on a battery lantern he found on one of the shelves. Placed there, he realized, not that long ago, within the last few years. George had been here recently. He had come here and prepared this space for Raymond's arrival. The lantern was fresh, the battery new. There was also a thermos of coffee that was perhaps a year old, and a folded piece of paper tucked under it that read, in his father's familiar hand, I know you'll need this. I'm sorry it took me so long to give you the key. Dad. Raymond sat in the light of that lantern and let himself feel grief for the first time since his father's death. Not the grief of the disinheritance, but something older and more tender. The grief of a son who has discovered that the distance between himself and his father was not about indifference or dismissal, but about shame. George had spent his whole life running from what his father had done, and he had kept Raymond at arm's length precisely because Raymond was the one person he feared would look too closely and find the truth. He had kept Raymond out of the business, out of the family wealth, at least in part, because he had never found a way to hand Raymond something that was built on a stolen foundation without first telling him the truth about what it was built on. And he had never, until now, been willing to tell that truth. Raymond finished the coffee. Then he kept reading. What he found in the last two boxes changed everything again. In 1978, George Calloway had apparently hired a private investigator to find the descendants of Heinrich Voss. The PI's report was there, carefully preserved. Heinrich Voss had returned to Germany in 1932, had survived the war in reduced circumstances, had died in 1961. But he had left behind children, 3 of them, and those children had had children of their own. The Voss family line had continued. They were alive. They were traceable. George Calloway had found them, had the report, had known where they were since 1978, and had done nothing for 30 years. And then, in the last few years of his life, had done something. In a folder marked recent, Raymond found letters. Correspondence in both English and German, carefully typed, between George Calloway and a woman named Anna Voss Hartmann, who was Heinrich's granddaughter, living in Munich. The letters went back 6 years. They were extraordinary documents, careful, painful, honest in a way that George Calloway's public persona never had been. George had written to Anna about what his father had done, had described the full extent of the theft, had provided documentation, had told her that he believed a profound wrong had been committed, and that he was trying, late in life and perhaps too late, to find a way to make it right. Anna Voss Hartmann had written back. Her letters were formal at first, then warmer. She was a professor of economic history at the University of Munich. She was 70 years old. She was not interested in litigation, she wrote. She was interested in the truth. The correspondence had continued, increasingly deep, increasingly human. In the last letter George had sent, dated 4 months before his death, he had written, I have arranged things so that my son Raymond will find these documents. Raymond is a good man, an honest man, better than I have been. I believe he will know what to do. I have not discussed this with my other children because I do not trust them to do the right thing. I trust Raymond. I have always trusted Raymond. I have not been good enough at telling him that. Raymond had to stop reading for a while after that. He stood outside the stone building in the February dark, breathing cold air, feeling the weight and wonder of what he'd found. His father had not overlooked him. His father had chosen him. Had chosen him for exactly this, because this required not a businessman or a socialite, but someone who could read the past with honesty and care and the willingness to do what was right even when it was hard. He drove home, laughed fitfully. In the morning, he made a list. First, he needed to understand the full financial scope of what had been stolen. He spent the next 2 weeks in the Stone Building and at the Newport Public Library and the Rhode Island Historical Society, working with the kind of focused attention he usually reserved for museum projects. He was good at this, genuinely, deeply good, at tracing the thread of financial records through time, following money as it moved and changed and compounded. What he determined, after careful analysis, was that Heinrich Voss's 50% stake in the Callaway and Voss partnership in 1931 had a present-day value, accounting for what that stake would have grown to over the following decades had it not been stolen, of approximately $4 million. It was an estimate necessarily, but it was a careful one. Second, he called Walter Ames and told him what he'd found. Walter listened without interrupting. When Raymond finished, Walter said simply, "Your father would be proud. He has been proud of you for a long time. He just didn't know how to say it without having to tell you why." Third, Raymond wrote to Anna Voss Hartman. He wrote in English, knowing she spoke it. Her letters to George had been in English, and he wrote with the directness he'd learned from decades of archival work, plainly, completely, leaving nothing out. He told her he'd found the documents. He told her about his research into the financial scope. He told her that he intended to do what was right, and that he wanted to know what she considered right to be. He hit send on the email and sat back and waited. He expected to wait days, maybe weeks. Anna Voss Hartman replied within 6 hours. Her response was brief and composed and remarkable. She said she had been waiting for this email, that George had told her it would come, that his son Raymond would write to her, and that she should trust him. She said that she did not want money, precisely, but she wanted acknowledgement, a formal, documented record of what had happened and what had been taken, available to the historical record and to the Voss family. She wanted the story to exist publicly because her grandfather had spent the last 30 years of his life trying to make people believe he'd been robbed, and no one had ever listened. She wanted him to be believed. She wanted that more than any dollar amount. And she said one more thing. She said that her grandfather had left behind, among his very few remaining possessions, a leather portfolio that he'd kept throughout his life, which contained, she believed, his own copies of certain partnership documents from 1921, documents she had never been able to read because they were in English. She asked if Raymond would be willing to look at them. He said yes immediately. The portfolio arrived by express courier 3 weeks later. Raymond opened it at his kitchen table with the same ceremony he brought to all significant archival moments, carefully, slowly, giving the material the respect of his full attention. And inside, preserved across 9 decades in the obsessive way of a man who knows he will one day need to prove what was done to him, was Heinrich Voss's complete set of partnership documents. His originals, signed by both men, dated, witnessed, 50-50, irrefutable. Raymond sat with these documents for a long time. And then, and this is the moment where the story begins its turn, he noticed something that he almost missed, that he would have missed had he been anyone other than a man who spent his career reading old documents with the deep, careful patience of someone who knows that meaning hides in the details. At the bottom of the original partnership certificate, beneath both signatures, there was a clause. A standard clause of the era. Boilerplate, really. The kind of thing lawyers added to partnership agreements in the 1920s that nobody paid much attention to. It read, "In the event of the dissolution of this partnership by either party, the full value of any assets developed jointly under this partnership shall remain subject to equitable claim by both parties or their legal heirs in perpetuity." In perpetuity. Raymond read that word 3 times. Then he called a lawyer. Not a general practice lawyer, not a family friend. He called a professor of contract law at Brown University, a woman named Dr. Carolyn Fitch, whom he'd met at a conference years before, and whose specialty was the enforceability of historical contracts. He described the situation. He described the clause. He read it to her verbatim. There was a silence on the other end of the line. Then Dr. Fitch said something that Raymond had not expected, and that changed the shape of everything that came after. "Raymond," she said, "do you know what the Callaway family's manufacturing business is worth?" He did. It was a matter of public record, since Douglas had taken the company public 3 years earlier. The current market capitalization of Callaway Industries was approximately $240 million. The original manufacturing business, Carolyn said slowly, Was it developed from capital that was part of the original partnership? Raymond went very still. He looked at the documents in front of him. He looked at the ledgers from 1921. The original seed capital for what would eventually become Callaway Industries had come directly from the Callaway and Voss Trading Company, a transfer of funds in 1929, 2 years before the dissolution, when both partners were still equal stakeholders. Both partners. Which meant that the manufacturing business, the real business, the $240 million business, had been seeded with jointly owned capital. This clause, Carolyn said carefully, may be enforceable. Not certainly. There are a lot of variables, and a court would have to decide, and it would be a very long, very expensive fight. But it may be enforceable, which means the Voss family may have a legitimate legal claim against Callaway Industries. Raymond thought about his brother Douglas, who ran Callaway Industries, who had gotten the house, and was expecting to spend the rest of his life wealthy and comfortable, and unchallenged. He thought about Pamela, who had the investment accounts, and the confidence that the family story was exactly what it had always appeared to be. He thought about what it would mean to bring this claim forward, the years of litigation, the public exposure, the destruction of the family reputation that Douglas and Pamela had built their identities around. And he thought about Heinrich Voss, who had come to this country with nothing, had built something with another man through years of equal work and intelligence and courage, and had been robbed of it through forgery and legal maneuvering, and the simple brutal fact that some men could afford better lawyers than others. And he thought about Anna Voss Hartmann, 70 years old, a professor of economic history, who had spent her career studying exactly the kind of inequality that her own family had experienced and never recovered from, who wanted, more than money, to be believed. Raymond made his decision. It wasn't a complicated decision, in the end, for a man built the way he was built. He called Anna. He told her what he'd found. He told her about the clause. He told her about Carolyn Fitch. He told her about Callaway Industries and its current value. Anna Voss Hartmann was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, in her precise, accented English, "Raymond, I want you to understand something. My grandfather did not spend his life trying to get revenge. He spent his life trying to get the truth recognized. There is a difference." Another pause. "What would you like to do?" "I'd like to do what's right," Raymond said. "I'm just not entirely sure what that is yet." "Then let us figure it out together," she said. "I think that is what your father would have wanted." This is when Raymond called his brother. The conversation with Douglas was not pleasant. Nothing about the next several months was pleasant. Raymond drove to Newport and sat across from Douglas in what had been their father's study. Douglas was already redecorating, Raymond noticed, already making the house his own, and laid out what he'd found, the documents, the history, the clause, the legal opinion. Douglas listened with the particular stillness of a man who processes threats by going very quiet before responding to them. When Raymond finished, Douglas leaned back in his father's old leather chair and said, "How much does she want?" "That's not the point," Raymond said. "It's always the point, Raymond. Everything has a number. What's hers? She doesn't want money, Douglas. She wants acknowledgement. She wants her grandfather's name attached to the real history of this company." Douglas laughed. It was not a warm laugh. "You're joking." "I'm not. The company went public 3 years ago. We have shareholders, Raymond. We have a board of directors. We can't just— There's no mechanism for—" He stopped, recalibrated. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted into negotiation mode. "What does your lawyer say?" "About the enforceability of this clause?" "She says it would be a long fight. Expensive. Uncertain. But possible." Douglas drummed his fingers on the desk. "And you'd do that? You'd actually take this to court? Drag the family name through a public lawsuit about something our grandfather did 90 years ago?" "I'd like it not to come to that," Raymond said, "which is why I'm here, talking to you, before I talk to anyone else. So this is a threat. This is an opportunity. Douglas. An opportunity to do the right thing before we're forced to." Douglas stared at him for a long time. Raymond watched the calculation moving behind his brother's eyes, the assessment of risks and costs and likely outcomes. This was what Douglas was good at. He was not, Raymond noted, asking whether it was true. He was not asking whether their grandfather had really done what Raymond said. He already knew the story was real. He could see it in the way Douglas's jaw tightened when Raymond mentioned the documents in the stone building. Douglas had known about the stone building, had never opened it, had never wanted to know what was inside. "Give me 2 weeks," Douglas said finally. "Let me talk to the board, talk to legal. 2 weeks, Raymond agreed. He drove home. He didn't hear from Douglas for 8 days. Then Pamela called. Raymond, her voice had a quality he hadn't heard from her before. Careful, slightly afraid. I've been talking to Douglas about what you found, and I need you to tell me honestly, how strong is the legal case? Raymond told her what Carolyn Fitch had told him. Pamela listened. When he finished, she said, "How do you feel about all of this?" The question surprised him. Coming from Pamela, who was usually so concerned with how things looked rather than how they felt, it surprised him. He thought about it honestly before answering. "I feel like Dad knew exactly what he was doing when he gave me that key," Raymond said. "I think he spent 60 years trying to convince himself he could live with what his father did, and he couldn't. I think he wanted this to be resolved. I think he trusted me to resolve it because he knew Douglas wouldn't, and he knew you'd follow Douglas." A silence. Then, "That's a hard thing to say. It's true though, isn't it?" Another silence. Longer. "Yes," Pamela said quietly. "It is. Pamela, do you want to do the right thing here? Because if you do, I could use your help with Douglas." The pause that followed was one of the most important pauses Raymond had ever waded through. He could almost hear his sister making the decision. The real one, not the easy one. The one that required her to step outside the comfortable story she'd been telling herself about the family her whole life. "Tell me what you need," she said. What followed was 2 months of the most intense negotiation Raymond had ever been part of. Douglas fought hard. He was a skilled, experienced businessman, and he knew how to defend a position. But he was fighting on unfavorable terrain, and he knew it. The legal exposure was real. The reputational exposure was real. And Pamela, once she'd committed to Raymond's side, turned out to be a surprisingly formidable ally. She knew Douglas, knew how to reach him, knew which arguments would land. The settlement they reached was not perfect, because these things never are. Callaway Industries did not disgorge $120 million, but it did the following. It made a formal, legally documented acknowledgement of Heinrich Voss's role as a co-founder of the company's financial origins, including his name on a revised corporate history. It established a charitable foundation in Voss's name, funded with $5 million, to support economic opportunity programs and immigrant entrepreneurship. Causes that, Anna noted quietly, her grandfather would have cared about deeply. It made a direct payment to the Voss Family Trust of $2 million, and it commissioned a professional historical record, a book authored by Raymond that would tell the full story, the partnership, the theft, the decades of concealment, and the eventual reckoning. Raymond wrote that book over the following year. It was the hardest thing he had ever written and the truest. He sent every chapter to Anna Voss Hartman as he completed it, and she returned each one with corrections and additions and memories her grandfather had passed down, stories of the early years of the partnership, the excitement, and the hard work, and the genuine friendship that had existed between Heinrich Voss and Edward Callaway before greed had destroyed it. The book that emerged was not a story of simple villainy. It was a story of the kind of moral failures that ordinary people make under pressure, and the generations of consequence that follow, and the possibility, always present, always difficult, of finding your way back to the truth. It was published by a small but respected press. It received modest attention in academic circles and somewhat more attention in the business press. Douglas refused to speak to Raymond for 3 months after it came out, then called one evening and talked for 2 hours about their father, and their grandfather, and the weight of certain inheritances. It was the longest conversation the two brothers had ever had. Pamela read the book in a single weekend and called Raymond crying. Not from grief, she said, but from something she couldn't quite name, something between relief and recognition. "I keep thinking about Dad," she said, "about what it must have cost him to live with this." "I know," Raymond said. "I think that's why he died looking a little lighter. I think he'd made peace with it." And here is what Raymond had not anticipated, what none of them had anticipated, what became the final astonishing turn of a story, already full of turns. Anna Voss Hartman came to the United States for the publication event. She was a small woman, precise and dry-humored, with her grandfather's eyes in an old photograph Raymond had seen. They had dinner together in Newport. Raymond and Anna and Pamela and, somewhat stiffly, Douglas. And the dinner was one of those rare occasions when people who have every reason to be adversaries discover instead that they are participants in the same story from different angles. Over dessert, Anna said something that Raymond had not heard before. She said that among her grandfather's papers, she had found a letter that Heinrich had written to his children in 1960, the year before he died. In it, he had said that the loss of the partnership had broken him financially, but had not broken him as a man, because he had the knowledge of what he had built and what he was worth. Knowledge that couldn't be stolen, even when the assets could be. He had told his children that what mattered was not the money, but the record. That the truth existed even when it was suppressed, and that truth, in his experience, was patient. It waited. It waited as long as it needed to, and eventually it found its way to the surface. Raymond thought about his father, driving to that stone building alone in his final years, preparing the lantern, writing the note, arranging everything just so. He thought about the key on the leather cord, pressed against his chest in the family study, while his siblings traded satisfied glances. He thought about a 13-year-old boy who'd found papers behind a false panel and brought them to his father and been told to forget them. A boy who had, it turned out, never quite managed to forget them at all. "Your grandfather was right," Raymond said to Anna. "He usually was," she said, and smiled. It was one of his more frustrating qualities. The charitable foundation, the Voss Foundation for Economic Opportunity, launched the following spring. Raymond served on its board. The book sold modestly, but consistently, and found its way into business school curricula in several universities, including, eventually, the one where Anna taught. A journalist wrote a long feature about the story for a national magazine, and for about 3 weeks Raymond was mildly famous, which he found largely bewildering and somewhat amusing. Douglas and Raymond did not become close, not exactly. But they became something real and complicated and earned, the way good things between complicated people always are. Douglas acknowledged once, in a conversation that Raymond suspected cost him considerable effort, that their father had been right to give Raymond the key. "You were always the honest one," Douglas said. "The rest of us were too busy being impressive to be honest." Raymond hadn't known what to say to that. He'd settled for, "You can be both." "Maybe," Douglas said. "I'm working on it." And Raymond? Raymond went back to Providence, back to his small apartment and his archival work and his careful, attentive, underestimated life. He was not rich. The settlement had gone to the Voss family, as it should, and his modest salary remained his modest salary. But things had changed in ways that didn't show on a balance sheet. The museum where he worked had published his book and seen it covered in the national press, and the subsequent attention had led to a grant and an expanded research position, and the kind of professional recognition he'd spent decades building toward, and never quite reaching. More important, he had done the thing his father had believed he could do. He had looked. He had found. He had acted on what he found, with honesty and care. He had made the story more true than it had been when he found it. One evening in the spring, nearly a year after his father's death, Raymond was sitting at his kitchen table with a glass of wine and the first copy of his published book, and he turned it over and looked at his own name on the cover, Raymond George Calloway. He thought about the note his father had left him. "You always were the one who knew how to look." He thought about how long it had taken him to understand that this was not a consolation prize, that it was, in fact, the thing his father had valued most and been least able to say. He thought about the key, which he still kept on the leather cord, which he still sometimes pressed against his chest. Not because it was valuable, because it was true, because it had opened something real, and real things, in Raymond's experience, were the only things worth keeping. He had been, for most of his life, the overlooked one, the footnote, the son nobody worried about because nobody thought much about him at all. He had received the smallest envelope and the most bewildering gift and the quietest, most difficult assignment of the entire estate. And from that single rusty key and that single handwritten note, he had pulled out a truth that had been buried for 90 years, and he had made it matter. The apparent loser, it turned out, had won, not by fighting the way others fought, not by demanding what was owed him, not by the aggressive, loud maneuvering that he'd watched his father and brother deploy their whole lives. He had won by looking, by caring enough to read carefully, by being, in the end, precisely the kind of person that rooms full of impressive, successful people had always underestimated, which is perhaps the oldest truth there is, and the one that keeps having to be rediscovered in every generation. The ones you overlook are often the ones who are paying the most attention. The ones you hand the smallest envelope to are sometimes the ones carrying the most important key. And the things that look worthless, the rusty, unremarkable, easily dismissed things, are sometimes the only things that open what matters. Raymond finished his wine. He put the book on the shelf. He went to bed. Outside his window, Providence was doing what it always did in spring, coming quietly, insistently back to life. Now, as we come to the end of this story, let's sit for a moment with what Raymond Calloway's journey really taught us. Because every story in the Hidden Vault carries something worth carrying away. The first thing is this: value is almost never visible at first glance. Raymond's inheritance looked like an insult, a rusty key and a cryptic note, handed to the overlooked son while his siblings walked away with mansions and millions. Every person in that room made an instant judgment, and every person in that room was wrong. The appearances were deceiving, as they so often are, and the thing that looked like nothing contained everything. The next time you look at something, or someone, and assume you already know its worth, remember that rusty key. Remember that the weight of a thing is rarely in its appearance. The second lesson is about the long patience of truth. Heinrich Voss tried his whole life to make people believe what had happened to him. He died before anyone listened. But he kept the documents. He told his children. He kept the record alive, because he understood, at some fundamental level, that truth doesn't expire. It waits. It accumulates. It finds the crack in the wall eventually, and pushes through. The truth George Calloway spent 60 years containing came out anyway. Not violently, not scandalously, but with the quiet inevitability of water finding its level. You cannot permanently suppress what is real. You can only delay it. The third lesson is about shame and the cost of carrying it alone. George Calloway was not an evil man. He was a man who inherited a stolen fortune and spent his entire life unable to face what that meant, unable to pass it on honestly, unable to tell the son he trusted most that he trusted him. The silence cost him and Raymond decades of real connection. The antidote to that kind of shame is not perfection. It's honesty, even when honesty is terrifying and late and imperfect. George found his honesty in the last years of his life, and it was enough, just barely enough. Don't wait as long as he did. The fourth lesson is about what it means to be underestimated. Raymond was overlooked his entire life, and while that was unjust, it also, in a strange way, left him free. Free to develop real skills without the pressure of performing success. Free to build genuine character without the corrupting attention of constant approval. The people who were busy being impressive didn't notice what he was becoming. Underestimation can be a gift in disguise, if you choose to use the space it gives you. And the fifth and perhaps most important lesson is this: the right person for the most important job is not always the loudest, the wealthiest, or the most obvious. Raymond was chosen for this task not despite his quiet, careful, archival nature, but because of it. His father recognized, late, imperfectly, but genuinely, that the work required someone who could read what others would overlook. Someone patient enough to sit on a cold stone floor for hours and care about what he found. Someone honest enough to do the right thing when the right thing was hard and unclear and cost him the comfortable, easy version of the resolution. The right person for the hardest jobs is often the person nobody is paying attention to. Often the person everyone has decided doesn't matter. Sometimes the greatest treasure really is the one hidden in the smallest envelope. Sometimes the most important key is the one that looks like it opens nothing. And that's another secret unlocked from the Hidden Vault, where things are never quite what they seem, and the greatest treasures are often hidden in plain